Hello, today we're talking about If It Bleeds, the novella collection from Stephen King. It's a little difficult to analyze a novella collection as a singular cohesive product. I'm basically just going to talk about all four of the stories individually, but the score I give it at the end is going to be sort of an aggregate of how I feel the quality of the four stories combined is, if that makes sense. I don't know, it doesn't matter. I'll just cut right to the chase and say that I think If It Bleeds is a kind of mid collection of stories. I don't think any of them are terrible, although I also wouldn't really categorize any of them as great either. They're all pretty inoffensive, and it seems like King just kind of had these stories lying around somewhere and decided to toss them together into a collection because he couldn't figure out where else to put them. Maybe that is just how he makes his collections anyway, but I'm pretty ambivalent about the first story here, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which is about this boy named Craig who gifts his elderly billionaire neighbor, Mr. Harrigan, an iPhone. Mr. Harrigan dies shortly after, and the narrative kind of takes a turn where Craig discovers that calling Mr. Harrigan's phone seemingly results in the demise of people who have wronged him in the past. Basically like Death Note with an iPhone, if you will. I thought there were some genuinely creepy sequences in the story. There's some striking images, but I just sort of felt like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be a spooky ghost story or if it wanted to be some sort of commentary on technology and cell phones, and as a result it kind of just like half-heartedly wades in either direction. Mr. Harrigan sending Craig a phone from the grave, I thought that was a genuinely creepy scene. And there's also the part where Craig goes to Mr. Harrigan's gravesite and like calls his cell phone and tries to listen to the ringtone through the ground. I really loved that part as well. I thought that was a really kind of cool image. But most of the rest of the story was pretty unremarkable to me. Just kind of bland, a little bit boring, but, you know, still readable. Even mediocre Stephen King stories are at least still readable most of the time. The following story, The Life of Chuck, I think I enjoyed a little bit more despite simultaneously being a lot more puzzled by it. It's more or less trying to explore this idea that every person has within them infinite multitudes. This idea is loosely based on a Walt Whitman poem, I guess. I Contain Multitudes. It's referenced multiple times in the story. Narratively, it explores this idea in reverse chronological order, plotting out the life of a pretty regular guy named Chuck. So Act 3, which is the first chapter in the story, depicts an extremely tense apocalypse scenario that is later revealed to be the dying thoughts of Chuck, who is suffering from a glioblastoma and dying in a hospital room. Act 2 then shifts backwards 9 months, and it's just this scene from Chuck's life where he's walking home from work one day and decides to join in this impromptu street dancing session with like a busking drummer. I won't get into it too much. The purpose of the scene is kind of also Chuck reflecting on some specific instance from his past, but the majority of the chapter is literally just Stephen King describing this dance session, essentially. The final chapter is Act 1, which delves into Chuck's youth and his grandpa's uncanny ability to foresee deaths in his childhood home's mysterious attic room. At the end of the story, Chuck actually foresees his own death in there, which was the scene from Act 3 / Chapter 1, which does give the story a nice symmetric circular quality to it. I don't know, there's just a lot going on in the story. It did feel a little bit directionless to me a lot of the time, and the three acts related to each other in such a tenuous way that it's kind of hard to see their connection with one another, even within the themes of the story. For instance, I loved Act 3 / Chapter 1, the whole apocalypse scenario, people running across town, trying to get on the internet the last time before they know it shuts down, rationing food, driving to schools through collapsing road infrastructure. It's just like a really, really intense chapter, but the entire concept is kind of abandoned right away, and then you realize that the entire thing was just imagined by Chuck in his head. And I know that ties into the I Contain Multitudes theme, but the entire concept just ended so quickly that it was hard to get much out of it, I guess. At the same time, though, I did think the story was pretty interesting, pretty dynamic, bordering on like experimental for a Stephen King story, honestly, and I appreciated it for that. I don't think it's my favorite story in the collection, but I would probably say that it's the most interesting, if that makes sense. And then you have If It Bleeds, the titular third novella in this collection, and the fifth chronological Holly Gibney story. It's a direct sequel to The Outsider, and probably my least favorite story in this collection, which is a shame because it is also by far the longest story in this collection. The plot is nearly beat for beat a rehash of the second half of The Outsider, which I already didn't really like that much. And despite more or less enjoying Holly Gibney as a character, I think she's continually found herself in some of King's least interesting stories for some reason. In If It Bleeds, Holly is on the trail of another very subtly different shape-shifting monster who feeds on fear, very similar to the creature from The Outsider. She discovers him because he assumes the identity of a TV reporter live at the scene of a school bombing, which we find out later was also his own doing. And just like always, she is immediately able to decipher the nature of this monster and dispatches it easily in a pretty predictable climax scene. It's just kind of hard for me to suspend my disbelief about some of Holly's supernatural detective skills, and on top of that, I thought this story was just a slog, to be honest. I didn't mind the interpersonal relationship stuff between Holly and her mother, and Holly and her uncle who's dealing with Alzheimer's, but that part of the story is very secondary to the plotty stuff about the shape-shifting monster. The plot itself just fell really flat to me, and that's always going to be a problem in the Mr. Mercedes universe, whose stories rely almost entirely on plot, as opposed to King's usual forte of deep characterization. So wasn't really a big fan of that one. Fortunately, I do think the collection ends on a high note with Rat, which is definitely my favorite of the four. Classic Stephen King premise. It's about a writer named Drew Larson who is attempting to overcome his history of failed novel attempts. He gets this sudden burst of inspiration and decides to head to an isolated Maine cabin, and just as his old writer's block is starting to set in, a massive storm happens to roll through the area, and all the power goes out, and then at the same time, Drew contracts this debilitating flu. In what might or might not be a fever-induced hallucination, Drew discovers a dying rat outside on the porch of the cabin and spares its life, only to realize that it can talk. There's this whole Faustian bargain thing where the rat promises that Drew will have success in finishing his novel, but at the expense of his friend Al dying. Drew takes the bargain, his friend Al does die, and Drew is forced to live with the guilt of his decision, even though he's never really fully sure if the rat was real or not. I really love how the story maintains ambiguity, never truly revealing the reality of the rat and the orchestrated deaths. As always, King does a really excellent job when he decides to inject some meta-commentary about the writing process into his stories. It's always a fun touch, and of course, you can draw some comparisons to The Shining with the whole idea of a writer driven to madness through isolation, which is a nice touch. I just think the story is kind of absurd and funny and endearing, and it is occasionally creepy too. It offers a genuinely unique exploration of sacrifice and the pursuit of creative goals. Great way to end the collection, and again, firmly the best story in If It Bleeds, I would say. All in all, in aggregate, I would say that If It Bleeds is a somewhat unremarkable collection from King in comparison with some of his other novella collections. It does have some great moments though. It does have some scary sequences, some interesting ideas and concepts here and there, but on the other hand, a lot of it is dull and sluggish, and its highs aren't really high enough to save the entire thing for me. Not terrible or anything, but hardly mind-blowing. That said though, I will keep reading Stephen King stories until the day the well runs dry. They can't all be winners, and even his mid-stories, again, are pretty readable, so that's fine. Just give me a rat every year or two, and I'll be all rat. Speaking of which, I'm going to give this story 6 rats out of 10.